If you want to learn something about the Najdorf variation, you could do worse than take a look at a game by the world chess champion Magnus Carlsen, who played the Najdorf in round 7 of the Grenke chess classic against Arkadij Naiditsch. Now, Naiditsch has actually caused upsets in the past. He defeated Carlsen twice, once in the Olympiad in Tromsø 2014 and then in the Grenke chess classic 2015. So Magnus knows he can be a difficult opponent. Naiditsch is a form player, I would say. He's incredibly optimistic and he doesn't really have any fear of any opponent in the world. That can be a good or a bad thing, but that means in the past, as I said, he has defeated Magnus on a couple of occasions. And I think this was a very clever choice of Carlsen to play the Najdorf variation, because it's a provocative move and Naiditsch is provoked very easily. He's an aggressive player. He also doesn't have such a big theoretical hit, so Carlsen could be fairly sure that, well, I think this variation would be a little bit unexpected. That's one thing, so there wouldn't be any great prep. But yeah, Naiditsch wouldn't have 28 moves of theory to wheel out. And indeed, Naiditsch played G3, a very solid move, a very sensible move, but not aiming to blow black off the board. You know, you can attempt that with bishop G5, for example. E5. I should say, of course, Magnus has played the Najdorf on previous occasions, but generally he shies away from such theoretical battles. But it's a very sound classical opening. You can see that in this case, black has established this nice pawn in the center of the board. That gives him room, and that's enabled him to put the bishop on this really chunky square on e6. I've had this position, I think, maybe 4 or 5 times in my chess career, and I've always enjoyed playing it with black. It's just positionally very, very sound. You know, in the past, people used to talk about black having a backward d-pawn and being very worried about that. That is never an issue in these kind of positions, just so long as you're aware the d5 square always needs covering, and of course black has tremendous cover for that with the bishop and the knight, and potentially this knight as well. Here a4 is the standard move to prevent black's queenside expansion, and then knight d7 and so on. But Naiditsch just played rook e1, which prepares a knight maneuver, and he can still play a4 here, but he is going for this knight maneuver. So he wants to play the knight round to e3 to gain some control over d5 and f5. But I think allowing this queenside expansion, it doesn't look right to me at all. This is exactly what black wants, because it starts this minority attack against the pawns, and there are already problems on the c-file, or potential problems actually. To some extent, with the knight on c3, you could say that the c pawn is a backward pawn. It's already turning into a target. So let's see, knight f1, and well, I think here normal moves, queen c7, knight b6, they both look very nice for black to me. But here, well, you could say a typical Carlsen move. He played a very provocative move. Bishop g4, so moving this bishop twice in the opening, so that's slightly frowned upon. Well, the strong players know when to break the rules, but typically provocative, because it gives white a slightly difficult choice. Do you move the queen? Well, you don't want to move it to d3 because that gets hit, or potentially gets hit. d2 looks a bit odd because it blocks the bishop. Do you want to play bishop f3? Well, you could do the trade of bishops and then rook c8, and perhaps the c2 pawn can already be targeted. Or do you play f3? And that's the move that was played. This is kind of the simple way to deal with a threat, of course. But it is exactly what black wants, because now this diagonal is open, the second rank is open. At the moment, not significant, but once we get to around move 30 and the position breaks open, just watch what happens. And this is so typical for the Najdorf and so typical for the Sicilian. More on that later. But yes, I think f3 was exactly what Magnus wanted. Personally, I think queen d2 is the sensible move, and then you can always play b3 and bishop b2 to bring out the bishop that way, and then you gain a tempo against the bishop with knight e3. I mean, maybe Naiditsch just didn't want his bishop on this side of the board, but anyway, f3 played. And the knight comes to e3. So I suppose on the plus side for white, he's been able to carry out his knight maneuver very quickly. So the game resumes its normal paths, but yes, it would be nicer to have that pawn on f2. Rook c8, starting the pressure on the c file. a3, so doesn't want to be upset by b4, and knight b6. So that looks at these very nice squares. Good move. And now Naiditsch went for f4. Somehow, with the pawn on f3, doesn't look very nice, blocking the bishop. And you could say, well, white has difficulty in bringing out this bishop. You can't play b3 because the knight is on prise. Do you really want to play a move like bishop d2? It doesn't look very attractive. It's not on such a great square there, but well, this one could play the modest move bishop d2. f4 is the typical Sicilian move. I think it's a mistake, and I think Magnus realized that as well. I think Magnus was already thinking he had a good position. Black should exchange on f4 and play rook e8, because these pawns and the king in general are somewhat vulnerable. I think particularly when the connection with the queen side is very bad. If we could magically place a rook over on this side of the board on f1, or king on h1 and rook on g1, then this would be fine. But at the moment, these pieces struggle to get into the game in any meaningful way. And black has a simple plan of putting the bishop back on f8. Maybe, if we have time, just switching that bishop round to c6 to hit the e4 pawn. And this is already very uncomfortable for white, particularly when you have such an open king. Magnus played rook e8 straight away, and that does give white the chance to play f5 to close the position. But the bishop is coming around to c6 to hit e4, and then there's a chance to break with d5. But Naiditsch played king h1, and well, of course the king is better in the corner. It's still not very well protected. And here Magnus again should just trade and play bishop f8, and he realized that after the game. It's just a very pleasant position for black. Instead he played bishop f8, and well, as he said after the game, he thought this was a bad move. And Naiditsch, after 15 minutes thought, realized that this was his chance to close the position. This is not a bad position for black, it's just that he's missed a big opportunity there. So the bishop switches round to this diagonal, putting pressure on e4 and also perhaps preparing d5. And here, well, the simplest move for white looks to be knight g4, trading those knights and preparing to bring the bishop out. It's the most obvious way of developing, and things probably aren't too bad for white in this position. Yeah, maybe bishop g5 coming and rook d1. There's still pressure on the c file, but white should be okay here. But instead Naiditsch played queen d3. h6 played, and there are still problems on the queen side because it takes a bit of time to bring these pieces into play, and in the meantime black can do some interesting things. b3, so that controls the c4 square. Bishop comes round, that's as advertised, and queen c7. Yeah, pressure building on the c-file. White can't actually do too much in this position. This is a problem. Black can actually build up very nicely here. And now Carlsen played queen b7, which strategically looks absolutely right, just increasing the pressure on the diagonal. He did consider d5. Now this is the classic break in these kind of positions when white has advanced the pawn to f5. That pawn on f5 going nowhere, you would really like to put it back on f2 so that the king is covered. And d5 starts to crack open the position. Absolutely typical break. Sometimes you can follow up with e4, sometimes take on d5. This bishop is threatening the pawn on a3. Black will recover one of the pawns, and well, his pawn, and has good play, but what Magnus just felt wasn't so clear, and he played queen b7 instead. Now d5 is starting to look very serious. Well, it was pretty serious on the move before. So Naiditsch threw the knight in on d5. Again, this is a very typical response from white, and so is black's response. Traded off and then put the knight back on d7. It's important that this knight has protection, because if knight e4, trying to remove the blockade, then the second knight can just take its place, and actually black is absolutely rock solid on the king side. And then play starts on the c-file. This c-pawn is backward, and this is where black's play is coming from. Now knight d1 was played. Black is better already, strategically, because white is doing nothing on the king side, and as I said, there's play here. And Carlsen said after the game that he felt he should have played bishop e7 and continued with this plan. Bishop d8 and putting it round to b6. So typical maneuver, and black has time to do this. Sometimes the bishop will be useful on d4. It's just on a superb diagonal, and don't forget that black wants to just double on the c-file, and it's a very, very pleasant position strategically. But instead, he was tempted, instead of this maneuvering, he was tempted to play e4. And so this cracks open the position. And, you know, he could see Naiditsch using up a lot of time, and he obviously felt that this was the moment to strike. So if bishop takes pawn, then we have knight c5, winning a piece. So queen d4. And once the e-pawn has moved, then black pieces can come into the game. And, well, Carlsen said after the game he felt that knight c3 was the best move. And he was kind of annoyed with himself, because he felt that this was a reasonable chance for white to survive this position. He said, I felt like I'd ruined my position, which he's being very, very harsh on himself. Position does start to get more random, but it gets more random with white's king exposed, black's king completely safe, and these pawns weak. Still feels very pleasant for black to me. Knight f2 played instead by Naiditsch, and this really is extremely good for black in this case. And Carlsen even said, I lost interest in the game at this point. It was just about trying to trick him after this. Incredible. So basically he's saying that he's lost the elegant strategic overview of the position, the grand strategic plan. And yes, his opponent is short on time, the position's getting messy, just about finding a trick. It's not elegant, but hey, that's life. So here we go. C4 played. You can see the d5 pawn was en prise. Carlsen takes and plays rook e5, and that is a tricky move. Of course, you want to take a pawn. And if rook takes, this is very interesting. Here, bishop takes pawn. This bishop, which was lurking at the back, suddenly pops into the game, and that is horrible for white. If the rook moves up, there's a queen b1 check. Thank you. Rook is in the bag. And if rook f1, okay, let's just take on c4. That'll do. In the game, rook e3 played, and this was taken. And queen b2. Now, this is such a nice position for black to play. And I can imagine Magnus just felt it was a matter of time before white cracked. Look at white's pieces. They're all a bit loose. Not one of them is supported by a pawn. So that means that white always has to take care of them somehow. You compare it with black's pieces. Well, this bishop doesn't look like it's doing much. Actually protects the king very well, but completely safe. The knight, supported by a pawn, completely safe. The rook behind the lines, but ready to pop out here, or maybe here, or on the b file, completely safe. So it's like black is getting a free hit at white's pieces. And that pawn goes. Well, I don't think white could hold that, actually. And now a5 is a good move, just rolling that pawn while white just tries to hold everything together. But Magnus was in full-on trick mode and played queen a2, just hitting white's pieces. And rook takes c4, so now he's a pawn up. And actually, objectively, I mean, objectively, that in a practical game, it's perhaps not worth saying that. Objectively, white still isn't that bad if he takes his queen out of this pin and throws the knight in the direction of the king side. And white is worse, but he's fighting in this position. But that's kind of irrelevant, really. Naiditsch, short of time, played king g2, and after rook c3, that is really nasty. Pin and win. Tying white up. If queen g4, I should say, trying to get out of this pin, then the d pawn drops, and well, that's two pawns, that's dreadful. Black's king completely safe, of course. So rook d1 played, and now excellent move from Carlsen. If he pushes the a pawn straight away, then after a check, then the knight is able to move, not so clear. So what Carlsen does first is play h5, excellent. So stopping queen g4 check. Of course, the pawn is immune because the knight is en prise. And moving the h-pawn even allows the bishop to pop out into the game. And well, white is just bound hand and foot here. There is absolutely no way out. Rook e1 played. This was the time control had been reached. This was move 40, and Naiditsch played rook e1 here. But let's just see what happens on queen takes h5. Of course, Carlsen will have calculated this. It's not very difficult, because now queen check and queen g5. The ending is naturally winning with this extra a pawn, and well, it would be pretty horrible to put the queen back on h3, and there's another pawn dropping, for example. In the game, rook e1 played. Rook takes knight. Black is now a piece up, and rook e3. So if rook takes, then queen takes. Black is just a piece up, and here Naiditsch resigned. So a very convincing victory by Magnus Carlsen, although there were a few moments in that game where he realized he did play a little bit inaccurately. However, a classic Najdorf. I've played this kind of game myself so many times in my chess career, where with black your king is completely safe, and strategically you have a really nice pawn structure, and white just kind of thrashes around and in the end creates weaknesses, and also the king, your opponent's king, is very exposed as well. If you want to see some more games, do check out the info tab. It's up there. And you can see a Carlsen playlist. And also you should be able to find the Naiditsch Carlsen game from Grenke 2015, which I'm pretty sure is on this channel. I seem to remember covering that a few years ago. And, well, do check out the other playlists in the description as well. Thanks for watching. 2 rounds to go. Can Carlsen still do it? He's a half a point behind Fabiano Caruana. It's going to be very exciting.